Holman. He's professor of history and actually the director of the Canadian Studies program at Bridgewater State in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. And he's originally from St. Catharines. He's authored a number of books and articles on hockey, and as you saw this morning, he's this year's recipient of the Brian McFarland Award. So,
thanks very much, Bill. I'm thrilled to be here. I was telling a few of you folks that I've been a member of SIR for a long time. Well, it seems like a long time to me. I think 2004, 2005, something like that. And I've been kind of a lurker online, right? Reading the newsletters and hearing all the news and Twitter feeds and all that sort of thing. But the last time I attended was in Moncton. And Steve Hardy and I actually gave a paper in Moncton. I don't know if anybody was there from this room. Yes? Yeah. Okay. Well, and that was at the very beginning of our book project. And so it's fitting, I suppose, in some ways that I can come back at the end of that process. What we found out with the book was that originally the manuscript was almost twice as long as it is now, and it's not a small book. All of you know that hockey's got such a wonderful, detailed history that you can't possibly tell its global history in one monograph. And so we had to cut a fair bit out. The publisher insisted on it. And so what we found ourselves with are a few stories, a few tangents, a few bits of evidence that are certainly worthy of pursuit, although they didn't make their way into the book as well. So what I'm going to be presenting to you today is one of those pieces in embryonic form, I suppose, that didn't make it into the book and is worthy of some discussion. Hopefully you'll think so. On the eve of the 20th century, a little noticed series of events occurred in Ottawa that helped transform hockey. As Paul Kitchen knew well and taught us, these events involved a guy called Alf Smith, one of the most skilled and sometimes most brutal players in the first generation of the game. Smith was born in Ottawa in 1873, and he was a natural athlete, a classic all-rounder, as the parlance of the time would have it. He starred in the 1890s for the Ottawa Capitals in lacrosse and for the amateur Ottawa Hockey Club in the winter months. And in the fall of 1897, he and all of the lacrosse Capitals were scandalized, accused by the Canadian Amateur Athletic Union of being paid to play and banned from all sports that were affiliated with the CAAU. Devastated, Smith sat out for almost 2 years. And then in December of 1899, he did what any athletic rule breaker with a bad reputation would logically do. He became a coach. Barred from using him as a player, the Capitals hired him as their hockey coach in their first season in the OHA. And in 1900, Smith jumped back to the Ottawa Hockey Club, where he led them to a 1901 Canadian Amateur Hockey League Championship. Now, Smith left coaching in 1901 to play in Pittsburgh as a pro, but then he returned to the Silver Seven in 1903 as a player when he was reinstated as an amateur. By then, the die had been cast. Quietly, without fanfare, the hockey coach was born. Elite senior hockey teams across Canada began to adopt the practice. And by 1920, as hockey spread across North America, the position became almost universal. And ever since, the coach has become a natural and expected part of hockey. This slide. Talk about natural and expect. Can you name them? Top left?
Brad Ryder?
No.
No, University of Minnesota Duluth coach.
Shannon Miller, former women's national team coach. How ashamed should we be? In Canada, here.
Claire Drake.
Claire Drake, yes. Oh, if you didn't get Shannon Miller, you're not going to get her. Katie Stone, U.S. national women's team coach.
Herb Brooks.
Herb Brooks.
Roger.
This guy, whoever he is.
Punch.
Punch.
Good luck.
Digit Murphy. She coached the Kunlun women's hockey team in the CWHL until its unfortunate recent demise. I think we all need to do a little homework on our women's hockey coaches. Now today, staging a game without a coach in place is almost inconceivable. And coaches are amongst the most prominent figures in the game, even if we can't remember their names. Research suggests that Alf Smith was the first. But even if he wasn't, and I'm not really sure it matters much if he was at the forefront of a really interesting movement that took place over the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Why the hockey coach? Why then? Steve and I suggest that the hockey coach was invented at a particular moment in the game's history, and for reasons that had as much to do with the times as they did with any burning need within the game to have somebody pacing the pine boards behind the team. And so what I'd like to suggest today is that there were 3 main reasons that have to do with the times, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, that helped to explain the rise of the hockey coach. The first one we might call diffusion, D-I-F-F-U-S-I-O-N, diffusion. As Steve and I argue in our book, 1895 to 1920 were the years when hockey made its big push outward from the earliest axis of popularity, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City. And as hockey spread across Canada and into parts of the United States, in the northern United States, coaching became a part of its centrifugal spread. Coaches, in other words, cropped up wherever hockey was new and where there was a need to explain the game to the unexperienced, to the great unwashed, as it were. And though it may have started in Ottawa, Montreal soon became hockey's first cradle of coaches. I know Bob used that expression earlier today for Windsor. In an earlier era, we might have made the same thing for Montreal. Ottawa and Quebec City were also almost as prolific, but Montreal was the first cradle. And it produced people like Barney Dunphy, coach of the Montreal Shamrocks, Art Ross, a Montreal Wanderer star who worked as McGill's first coach in 1910, well before his career as NHA and NHL coach. Nick Balfe, a former Canadian and Wanderer who was hired by Queen's University in 1919, Cornell in 1920, where he coached for 27 years. Tom Hodge, another ex-Wanderer, was hired at Dartmouth in 1909. In the wake of Alf Smith came other coaches from Ottawa. Percy Lesueur, the Star Senators goalie hired by Columbia in 1910, and Skeen Ronan, recruited in 1912 to coach an ambitious senior team in Moncton, New Brunswick. Edward Hogan, a champion with the Quebec Bulldogs, hired to coach Dartmouth in 1911. Winnipeg's Stanley Cup success in 1896 spawned its own coaching diaspora as well, including guys like Tom Howard, a Stanley Cup winner with the Victorias, who was hired at Yale and Columbia Universities in the 1900s and 19-teens. It should be said also that Tom Howard's wife, another Winnipegger by the name of Catherine Cron Howard, coached the short-lived St. Nicholas Reds women's team in New York in 1917. And as Roger will tell us, Hugh Dad Gawley, also from Winnipeg, was a widely loved and successful coach of the St. Paul Saints beginning in 1915. The list of examples could go on. In any case, the first generation of coaches followed the game out of its early hotbeds and into its hinterlands. And who better to guide the newcomers than those who played hockey in its ground zero? The second demonstrable reason, we would argue, is what we might call efficacy, or in other words, the rise of the hockey expert that happens in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Hockey coaching was born in the progressive era, an age of entrepreneurial competition and bureaucratic rationality, an age of scientific management, and the ascendancy, the cult, if you will, of the expert. Progressives made heroes out of experts, people like F.W. Taylor, no, not Frederick Wellington Taylor, but Frederick Winslow Taylor, who invented scientific management and revolutionized the way steel was made in Pittsburgh and other places. In other words, those people who could master scientific wisdom and then apply it to real-world problems. Hockey underwent its own progressive search for order in these years as well, including things like the standardization of rules, the organization of regional and national governing bodies that had codes of ethics, constitutions, and formal executive councils. When we look back at some of these records, we find it passes strange a little bit to see how formal some of these organizations that was, at the end of the day, just a bunch of guys playing hockey after all. It passes strange to us. In that context, here's where hockey created and elevated its own experts, those people who understood the game scientifically. Experts need credentials. So how did the first coaches claim expertise? Only snippets of evidence remain for us, but there were a variety of bona fides. Experience as a player on winning teams was the strongest and most common. If you were a winner, of course, then you could teach winning to others, right? Stanley Cup winners like Ross and like LeSueur and Howard had a kind of mojo in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In the United States, and this might be starting to lose its punch in the 21st century, in the US, Canadianness mattered as a symbol of excellence and knowledge. So, for example, Dartmouth's alumni magazine trumpeted in 1909 that the ex-Montreal Wanderer Tom Hodge would, and I quote, revolutionize and introduce the Canadian style of play. Canadianness, of course, was the thinnest sort of credential, and no doubt led to some disappointment. At the end of the day, expertise had to be demonstrated. What good coaching actually entailed in these years is harder to nail down. Sources don't tell us very much about how coaches envisioned and organized their work, and it was work. What exactly was Alf Smith doing when he drilled his players in practice? What kind of pre-game, post-game, in-game regimen did they have? How did these coaches relate to players? So Jack Marshall, as you see here, the coach of the NHA's Toronto Blue Shirts in 1914, according to one Toronto newspaper editorial, had, and I quote, a system of coaching all his own. He doesn't drive his players, but he tells them what they don't know about the game afterwards, and when the occasion arises and his foghorn voice can be heard at the corner of Queen and Church Streets when a workout is underway. Coaches with less natural volubility resorted to barking orders through megaphones. I came across this, this is a really cool idea. We can't imagine it today. A practice that was legalized by the NHA in 1912, but even from its inception it was criticized by lots of people, including Art Ross, who found megaphone coaching ineffective and frankly annoying. How to coach? In these decades, the first coaches were creating the position step by step. The next generation of coaches, and every generation thereafter, would have it much easier. The biggest invention in these years was the articulation and implementation of system, or combination play, by hockey coaches. In other words, an attempt to impose some degree of order on what had been a pretty chaotic exercise before then. Known for its speed and violence, hockey by the 1890s left it to coaches to devise combination plays that worked. This was now the challenge. So Harvard's first coach, a guy called Ralph Windsor, for example, noted in 1918, there's a science to hockey. It's much more than a general barnyard scramble. Coaches in these years were the game's first deep thinkers and strategists. Percy LeSueur, who I mentioned before, wrote a pamphlet about it. Windsor invented what he called the American system. 4 forwards abreast, all of whom checked back and attacked forward, patrolling their lanes in both directions. And 2 defensemen who played parallel to one another. Here are the words of a New Brunswick native and captain of the Boston Arena Hockey Club, a guy called Frank Red Sinnott. On a big rink like the Boston Arena, he wrote, it is Windsor's brand, that is, his strategy, is superior to the Canadian brand. When a team can spread a forward line across the ice and hold its lanes, it takes a snappy combination of players to overcome in this game. Okay, there's a third final reason. Historians like to count in threes, as I've learned, so we're counting in three again today. The third and final reason is an important one as well. The rise of the hockey coach can be explained by professionalization, because it's during this period, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, that we see open professionalization take place in our sport. And this involved 2 different elements. The first of these elements is this, that in these decades there was a kind of shake-up that took place among jobs in the hockey world, of the tasks that different people did in hockey administration. The coach was one of the products of this shake-up. Before about 1900, most hockey clubs had 2 different sides to their organizations. You had playing members, one of whom was a captain, and then on the other side you had management. A manager, a president, a secretary, and treasurer, all of these folks who booked ice, scheduled opponents, hired referees, collected dues, paid the bills. The coach now straddled this divide, taking charge of the on-ice training and tactics from the captain, and at the same time assuming an off-ice managerial role. He became the team's public face and the team's public voice. Moreover, this coach was essentially a commercial product, a symbol of hockey's corporatization. The coach emerged during North America's era of sports professionalization, which historians have referred to as Canada's athletic war. Some of you will have seen the references to that in the past. And that was no coincidence. When we talk about professionalization, all of us hockey historians have, until fairly recently, I think, focused pretty clearly on the players. The painful transition towards openly paying players like Cyclone Taylor, Newsley Lalonde, the Patrick brothers, Hod Stewart, others. The people who become, at the time anyway, according to some journalists, the scapegoats, the people on whom were placed blame for bringing the amateur ideal crashing down in the early 1900s. I think what we would say is that that idea is a bit too narrow. That the most important hockey professionals in the first 2 decades of the 20th century were not the players, whose shelf life was typically 5 to 10 years. The real professionals were the growing body of coaches, administrators, officials, and journalists who carved out long careers for themselves in the game and were paid for it. Between 1900 and 1920, increasingly coaches were paid and paid to win. And as such, they epitomized both the quest for excellence and a flouting of the amateur code. After 1905, the conflict bubbled up in Canadian and American universities, which were seen at the time to be the last bastions of the amateur ideal. Students, alumni, administrators, all of them battled over this matter. Do we pay a professional coach and win? Or do we take our chances with an unpaid graduate coach? McGill went pro for good in 1910. Ottawa U stuck with its revered and unpaid Catholic priest, Father Stanton, as their coach. And at Harvard, Ralph Windsor was technically a graduate amateur throughout this whole period until the early 1920s. But other schools pendulated back and forth between paying coaches and sticking to the amateur ideal. Yale, for example, hired a pro coach called Tom Howard, the same Tom Howard in 1907, rehired him in 1913 after he had dashed for another better paying job in Columbia. In 1916, Yale loudly condemned him and hiring all of pro hockey coaches, but that only lasted 3 years until the school hired a guy called Talbot Hunter, another Canadian. Queens, on the other hand, their students glorified in the doings of their volunteer graduate coach, a true amateur, a guy called Dr. Jock Hardy, in the 19-teens for both his effectiveness and for what he stood for, what he represented. Here's the voice of one student editor of the Queen's. Hardy knows what hockey is. He has given his services in return for only the thanks of the players and the unexpressed gratitude of the student body. He is a wholesome influence. Still, when Hardy died of the Spanish flu in 1919, Queen's wasted little time in wooing a professional coach. After one old Ottawa pro, Frank Nyberg, turned down their offer, another one, Nick Ball, took the job. Finally, the University of Toronto varsity went pro in 1919, hiring Frank Carroll, who led them to the Ontario Hockey Association crown. When the school had a peak of amateur conscience in 1920, it fired all of their pro coaches across all of their varsity teams. They let Carroll go too. But that peak of conscience didn't last very long. And in fact, by 1923, varsity had returned to the pro model and hired a new hockey coach for pay, a symbol of hockey's commercialization in the 1920s. Any guesses as to who they hired? No. Conn Smythe. Conn Smythe, who ended up leading them to more Ontario Hockey Association championships in the middle of the 1920s. Okay, enough said. In a short span of time, that is about 20 years, first Alf Smith and then dozens of others invented the hockey coach, a modern, progressive expert whose scientific knowledge of hockey translated into power within it. It was a product of hockey's second generation, and it is something that we have lived with ever since. Thank you. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments.
I got a quick one here. You didn't mention like the influence of baseball or football and all that.
Yeah.
Like obviously that had to have had some effect on their decision.
Football especially, yes. Baseball not so much because it was kind of a lost cause. It had been wholly against what the amateur ideal had stood for well since the 1870s anyway. But football, yeah, and you can see that some of the discussion that takes place in these university columns and in the bigger newspaper articles that are written at the time do make that comparison. So, but the football coach as a professional is not really the first one, actually. It's rowing, believe it or not, that becomes the main controversy. And that's as early as the 1890s. It comes and goes. In American universities, the football coach, of course, is the big focus. In Canadian universities, the controversy is pinned more on hockey coaches than on any other athletics. It's a great point.
More and more as I watch hockey and stuff like that, talk about X's and O's and stuff like that. I'm sorry. I think, get your comment. I think motivation. If you get, let's go look at Rod Brindamore at Carolina. I did with his team this year. I mean, how much of this is X's and O's for any coach? And by the way, that doesn't last forever either, because guys, I think you got a shelf life like of 3 years. Pat Burns lasted I think 3 years in Montreal, 3 years in Toronto, 3 years in Boston, gone. Because after a while they just weren't listening. So the X's and O's aspect kind of, how complicated is the game of hockey? Drop the puck and play. And if the other team can't figure out, we got this secret plan or whatever, like how stupid are they? And when you hear coaches at the end of the game say, wow, we couldn't stop this, we couldn't. Between periods in your dressing room, what did you tell your players to stop that?
Yeah.
It wasn't working. So I think motivation is the big thing. I don't know your comment.
It's a great point, but I'm not sure that you can extricate one from the other. Okay, the reason why Rod Brindamore is able to motivate his players is because they think he knows what he's talking about. If he didn't have a mastery of the X's and O's, whether they're effective or not, they would know it, and he would lose his control over them. And you're right about shelf life too these days. Coaches, particularly the ones that are in the age of big salaries, who are sterner with their team, they don't last very long. Now there's another job waiting for them somewhere else, because there's another team that has young players with whom you can use a iron rod and get away from it. Right? But I don't think you can say one or the other. It's usually a combination.
A guy like Don Cherry, okay, and not to put him down, I mean, okay, whatever, but when he went to, I mean, I say, when I was at St. Mike's and we had the majors and Mississauga had the Ice Dogs, there was one parent I talked to, his kid had been traded from the Ice Dogs to St. Mike's, and he said, what a frickin' disaster it was over at Mississauga with Don Cherry. He says, you went, like, we had a practice one time where the drill was to shoot the puck, bring it around the board as far as you could go, stand at one blue line, see if you could get it all the way around and fresh ice to the other end. He said, they did that for an hour. I think,
But if I may, I know we're, like certain examples, like for example, if you talk to the guys on the 70s Canadians, they hated Scotty. Bob may back me up on this. They did not like him at all.
They didn't send him Christmas
They didn't send him
cards.
Christmas cards,
Not
nothing.
even in Detroit.
Not even in Detroit. They didn't like him in Detroit either. But to a man, if you ask those guys, we got the smartest guy here behind the bench in terms of line matchups, strategy, the whole deal. So, and I don't think anybody, Scotty Bowman ever do a great rah-rah speech?
No, actually, one of the funniest stories I ever heard about Scotty was when they played Colorado in Game 7 of the Western Conference Final in 2002. They said he came in the room and started cracking jokes and had everybody just laughing their ass off. And when they went out on the ice, they were as loose as a goose, and they beat Colorado 7-0.
Well, I think it goes back to the whole idea, the aura of the expert, right? You don't have to love him, but you're motivated perhaps by the notion that he knows what he's talking about.
Very good question. You talked about just using megaphones in the NHA or NHL.
NHA, yeah.
Was that during play?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, from the bench.
Like Jimmy.
Yeah. Well,
Just like.
I think that was more of. I think that was more of.
Who's the real wrestling fan?
One more question.
We took the swing away, but this guy, one of them, he had the same shirt as friend as Don Cherry. You notice the thickness of the collar?
That was the style back
Is that the secret?
Don stealing from the past.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.